You are listening to episode 38 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Jayarava joins us to speak about his blog, Jayarava's Raves, and his thoughts and reflections on being a pragmatic Western Buddhist. Secular or religious. It's like you're choosing decaf or rocket fuel. We remain critical of each other's ways of approaching our traditions, even within the traditions themselves, and simple questions can be taken as disrespectful rather than simple questions. Of course, sometimes we do mean to be derisive. When there are claims that are demonstrably incorrect and are harmful, like the disproven claim that vaccination causes autism, those claims should be aggressively debunked. Without such actions, we have things like the recent deaths from preventable illnesses like whooping cough in California. Other times, when claims are neither demonstrable nor traceably harmful, we may be better served by respectful engagement than divisive speech. I'm guilty of it, and am trying to do a better job of monitoring things like the quotes which I post in the Facebook fan page. Sometimes an honest question can be interpreted in a way that is not intended. But sometimes I've also posted links or quotes that are openly harsh without needing to be. Fortunately, we have choices. We can be openly atheistic and respectful, engaging with those whose practice isn't meaningful to us without sacrificing the integrity of our own point of view. My guest today has done an admirable job of demonstrating that balance of being a pragmatic Westerner questioning with a critical mind our Buddhist practice. Jayarava's approach to Buddhism is based on the teachings of Sangharakshita, the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order. He has supplemented this with his own study and practice, the results of which can be read on his blog, Jayarava's Raves. He is particularly influenced by scholars such as Sue Hamilton, Jan Napier, Paul Harrison, Greg Chopin, and Richard Gombrich, and takes into account ideas and discoveries from evolutionary biology and neuroscience. So, sit back, relax, and have a warm pint. Hey, our guest is in the United Kingdom, so tepid beer it is. And today we are speaking with Jayarava. Jayarava, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for asking me.
Oh, very glad to. I was very encouraged by the level of scholarship that I've seen in many of your blog posts, and in fact just today linked to your most recent one on the Facebook fan page for the Secular Buddhist. So now you've got at least 738 more people who are taking So one of the things I wanted to ask, as I usually do in these interviews, is to tell us a bit about your background and what led you as a Westerner to have a Buddhist practice.
Yeah. Well, I'm from a small town in a small country, New Zealand. I thought, actually, I mean, this is funny because we'll talk about rebirth, but I thought I had no contact at all with Buddhism until I was an adult.
Mm-hmm.
But the TV show Kung Fu was on.
Oh, yes. So many of us say that was our introduction. You're right.
Yeah, well, I didn't know it until just recently, but it was. But that was on, and yeah. I mean, so I grew up in this small little place, and then we moved to the city. And, I was always interested in science. I've got a degree in chemistry, and very interested in science, and pursued that throughout my sort of education. But by the time I'd finished my degree, I'd kind of realised that all the answers, the answers to the problems I had weren't there anyway. Shall we say? So I was having problems with depression, and that continued. And after a while, one of my friends said, "Oh, maybe you should try meditating." And I fobbed him off a few times. So then one day he gave me the hard word, and he said, "Oh, you've really got to go and learn to meditate." So
a meditation intervention, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And I looked around for courses, and I saw this thing at a Buddhist center, and I thought, "Oh, that sounds interesting." And I went along, and funnily enough, it wasn't the meditation that got me. It was the community of people. I just really enjoyed this quite vibrant and a vibrant community, but they were also talking about stuff that I'd heard about before, but talking from the sources, and I quite liked that as well. It's like, oh, that's a Buddhist thing. Oh, yeah, okay, I've heard that. So, I just started hanging around really, and that was about 16 years ago, and I just kept reading the books, found the books fascinating, found the people fascinating, started going on retreats, found retreats very difficult.
As many of us do, especially in the beginning.
Oh yeah, I had a few traumatic retreats, but I got better at it, and eventually I started enjoying going on retreats.
Yeah. And what were some of the challenges that you were facing on retreats that made them hard?
It kind of relates to recurrent depression and difficulties around that. So that kind of thing. Like not having anywhere to go, I think, on retreat was, I found difficult to start with. Just being with myself, I found quite difficult. So, it took a few years to get more used to that. But about 5 years ago, I did a 4-month retreat, and that was I got ordained on that retreat. So I'm a member of the Triratna Buddhist Order, and that was a real highlight of my life, and we built up to very intense meditation practice and silence for quite long periods of time. So I sort of grew into it. But I think for me, spiritual community, I think it had been missing in my life. I was aware, for instance, that my brother had a community that was revolved around sport and playing rugby. And I was like, oh, I don't have anything like that. And when I got involved in Buddhism, the community side of it really appealed to me. And so, on the whole, Buddhist communities are very positive and supportive, and provide quite a good context for.
It's interesting. A friend and I just had lunch today, and we were talking about another friend of ours who's going through a hard time with depression. His wife has just passed away from cancer. And one of the things that we were chatting about is that our dear friend, really of that couple, his wife was the outgoing one and had the involvement with us as the community of friends in our particular area here. And now that she has gone on, he's dealing with depression itself, which B then is being exacerbated by his not having his own community or interest that's outside of just being by himself. And it's not that solitude is a bad thing. Many of us really enjoy our solitude and get a lot out of that, and that's how we recharge. But when one is struggling with things like depression, it can be difficult, and finding a community really can help bolster one in getting out of that rut. And so it's not surprising to hear that finding the vibrant and a useful and energetic and helpful community like that
Yeah.
would help,
Yeah.
especially over time. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, people have this funny view about Buddhists, about how we should all be, really happy and together, and they don't think about what attracts people to Buddhism and why people get interested in something like Buddhism. It's got usually because they've had some kind of crisis in their life.
Right. We got
a lot of the time,
suffering.
So actually you meet a lot of people who have, been through crises or or whatever, so they're not always these bright, shiny, happy people. But
right. And, it seems that in Western sanghas more so, and I don't know if this is so or not. I would be curious to find if there's a study on this, is that the people who are culturally Buddhist, if you're Sri Lankan or Thai or wherever, that you are part of this community because it's what you grew up with. It's part of your
you're born into it. Yeah,
and that as a Westerner coming into it, what I typically hear is one of a few things. The first and most common one is that there is some suffering, some trauma, some challenge that's going on where the standard coping mechanisms, and I'm borrowing a phrase from a friend I was on a retreat on several years ago, are just no longer doing the job, and you need something else. And you're steered towards meditation, and you find community and a teaching that's very helpful. And I would suspect that's probably the biggest one for many of us in the West. And then, of course, people coming into it from martial arts. I want you to tell the full background story, though, of Kung Fu, because I've read a bit about this, but it's a fun story, so I want you to tell us about it.
Oh, yeah. I think I put it on one of my blogs.
Yep.
As an adult getting involved in Buddhism, I had these memories, when I was about 11 years old, of, sitting down and meditating. And just having generally a positive view of Buddhism. I mean, my little town back in New Zealand, there was just nothing like that. So I was like, so where did I possibly get that from,
It must be
there
a
was
previous
no
life.
That's it. It had, and I'm quite skeptical, so I was going, well, maybe that was from a past life. And, later on, when I was a teenager and I was thinking about religion, I mean, my mother started off as a fundamentalist Christian and then fell out with the church and went on a pretty amazing wide orbit through Hinduism and everything New Age that you can imagine. So when I was a teenager, my mother was shaving her head and going to India and waving crystals around and all that stuff,
And not like in Land of the Lost where you combine the right colors and they blow up and chase away the slee stack, but no, crystal clipping to feel good.
So me being a Buddhist is actually not that unusual in my family. But, there wasn't much in the way of, religion when I was a youngster, but then, so when I was a teenager thinking about religion, I thought, the Buddhists seem okay. But I had nothing to base that on. When I thought back, I thought, well, how did I know that? So I had this sort of thing lurking in the back of my head about, wow, is this an example of a past life memory? Have I sort of brought an affinity for Buddhism with me?
And there was the suggestion in your mind that was there.
Well, you can't rule it out, can you? And anyway, I bought season 1 of Kung Fu and started watching it. And I was like, this seems pretty familiar, actually.
I remember this.
That's right, he does Kung Fu, but he's a Buddhist monk, isn't he?
Those pithy phrases from Master Po, that's where it comes from and why I keep thinking silver eyes every time I meditate. Okay.
Yeah, so, I sort of, that's quite funny really, isn't it? And
it is, but many of the people listening to this podcast are going, yeah, been there.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny what draws people into Buddhism. Lots of people I know read the Lobsang Rampa books, which were written by this English plumber who sort of lived a suburban life and never had been to Tibet, wasn't a Tibetan Lama. So that I think in a way, it makes it's good to be able to make sense of those memories in a way, in that sort of way,
And we'll come back to rebirth in a few minutes because I think that sets the stage very nicely to some different conversations about that. But I wanted to cover some other things as well. Is that you describe yourself as agnostic about many Buddhist beliefs, but fundamentally pragmatic in your approach to the Dharma. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What that means to your practice?
I'm not, I mean, you know, in terms of practice, when I meditate, I just do the techniques and, so I'm not sure in terms of meditation practice how it comes out. But I mean, one good example is we were talking tonight about, karma and rebirth. But, you know, I was thinking about the interview a bit and, someone brought up the example of, you know, what happens to a murderer. You know, what's their destination or what's the outcome of doing a murder, and I think for me, like I just quite quickly switch off in those kinds of discussions, or at least I try and steer it back because usually, well, I don't think I have met a murderer, but people aren't talking about their experience, yeah. So if you're trying to talk to me about, you know, what is the karmic effect of doing a murder, I can only ask you, well, what was it like the last time you did a murder? Mm-hmm. And you're going to say to me, well, actually,
hopefully you're having this discussion through, you know, bulletproof glass and over a telephone. Yeah.
Yeah. So, actually most people aren't in those situations. So that's not a relevant ethical dilemma for most people. So it's more like, you know, dealing with rude people or, you know, frustration in traffic. Actually, that for most people, that's a more real ethical
That's dilemma. Much more visceral. We all understand that.
Yeah. And you know, you have experience. You get angry and you know what that's like on the basis of whatever it is that you thought made you angry. And so I think in terms of pragmatism, that's where it comes into, that's one way it comes into my practice in terms of communicating the Dharma and trying to talk about it and trying to make it more realistic for people. Yeah.
Now your endorsement of the scientific method on the Buddhist Geeks website, you posted was referred to as dry and reductionist and materialistic. I of course don't find these to be bad things. I would kind of encourage a reductionist materialistic view, and I have this discussions with people who use that criticism. I say, well, the Buddha reduced self to 5 heaps. You don't get much more reductionist than that, so why is that a bad thing? That is a practice.
Yeah, Buddhism is reductionist in that sense, in that it explains more complex things in terms of simpler things.
Right. Beautifully said. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were about having that kind of response to really what this practice is and can be.
I mean, maybe if I go back, you know, the context of that discussion was someone saying that we should treat rebirth as a scientific thing, you know, and investigate it scientifically. And I went and looked at the website of the researcher that was referred to, and I could see that, to some extent he was doing science, but, you know, things like, well, his informants were all little kids, and some of them were so young that you couldn't really expect them to even have a theory of mind. You know, they were 3 and 4, and I mean, what sort of evidence are they giving you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like, well, okay, if we're going to do the scientific method, let's really do it, you know.
Right.
Let's take it on. So I was being a bit provocative there.
Well, I think you're being very rational and reasonable in your expectations that if someone does have this memory, because I remember reading that the whole discussion back and forth.
Yeah.
When it was occurring, I was also reading there and participated a bit in that talk. And you made points like, well, okay, if they do remember an actual past life, as people who are on that thread were claiming, well, I've had this experience, and they may have, and we're not saying that the experience itself didn't occur. We're just wondering what the explanation is. And if it is a previous life, then you should be able to say, well, in this circumstance, I was, you know, my name was Bob in way back when, and you should find the remains of my house here from this period, and I can describe it to you for something that hasn't even been discovered yet. Those would be more valid evidence than a year after a child in Sri Lanka remembered people from another town and they've been contaminating each other's stories for the past 12 months.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not evidence. That's hearsay. These are anecdotes. And
exactly. Yeah.
And one of the things that I do, and I've mentioned this before, is I admire Ian Stevenson in the introduction to his book. I think it's 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. He's very clear that this is not scientific evidence, that this is suggestive. Something that this is really interesting. But they're just
the funny thing about Westerners is a lot of us really want to believe in rebirth, but for the wrong kind of reasons.
For the wrong reasons, because for us it's continuity, which we like.
Yeah, that's it. I think we see it in terms of personal continuity, but actually rebirth is a complete disaster from the Buddhist point of view. The goal is, I was looking at some Pali text this morning, and, the goal is not to be reborn. Is to get out of that cycling round rebirths. And I don't know that many people actually see rebirth in that way. That's how the Buddha talks about it. He talks about it as this really terrible thing, this horrible burden that's put on us when we have to come back again and again. But I think for Westerners, they like the idea, and it means they can put things off. Like people say, I'll do that in the next life. And it's like, well, maybe if you come back as a human, what happens if you come back as a dog,
Mm-hmm. And that takes away from one's dedication to improving things in this life for people. And in your blog, and one of the things that I wanted to mention about that is you have as the, one of the things you mentioned in, Jayarava's Raves is the name of the blog. For people who are listening to the podcast, first off, I do recommend you go to the web page for this episode, because I do have links to these things, you can check that out. But in case you're not, if you go to http://Jayarava, JAYARAVA.blogspot.com. You'll find the blog there, and you chat a bit about this, is that it's really about things that are very helpful within this life.
Well, yeah, I think, a lot of the time what we're trying to do is explain why is this happening to me?
Mm-hmm.
Why me? Often that's our question. Why me? Why is this happening to me? Why have I got cancer? Or why has my friend got cancer?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm getting old enough now that my friends do get cancer,
I having had cancer a few years ago, I'm totally with you on that one.
Right, yeah. And you want to know why, and, it's a natural enough question, but, I think when you really look at it, karma doesn't actually provide a very good answer to that. And what's even worse is actually the traditions are quite confused in the way that they talk about karma. It's having begun to study it a little bit, I realized, well, actually, I'm not sure I understand this. And then, I focus mainly on early Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
But there's Tibetan Buddhists around, and I go to talks in town sometimes by Tibetan lamas, and they're very much of the opinion that everything that happens to you is a result of karma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the early Buddhist view.
No, it absolutely isn't.
A couple of times says that not everything that happens to you is a result of karma.
Right, it's one of, the Abhidhamma has, and even the Abhidhamma being a later text still describes it as one of, 40-some different causes, and that it includes, physical ones and natural disasters and all sorts of different things that have nothing to do with one's volitional actions in a given lifetime.
Yeah. And even if they did, how would you know?
Right, and there's a convenient forgetting of the tracing the trails of karma is one of the things that, don't do that. Is what the early Pali
drives you mad.
Don't do that. You're never going to figure it out. It's going to be a distraction for you.
Yeah. So, in a way, like, is that the best question to answer anyway? I suppose, I suppose there's value in trying to see retrospectively the consequences of our actions. But, I'm not sure that that's the best approach. But where I have kind of said I think karma has some, benefit or potential benefit is if you believe that whatever you do, you have to live with the consequences, and even if you die, so there's no karmic tax exile equivalent. If you really believed that, then I think that would probably positively affect the way you behave. I think it would make it easier for you to behave ethically, and that would feed your practice and speed your progress. I find it quite hard to believe that because I'm a skeptic and I don't kind of think like that. But I don't go around trying to undermine people's belief in karma.
Right. Yeah.
I do tend to direct them forward rather than back if it comes up in a conversation.
I think you're touching on that difference that those of us, I share with you a more skeptical view of things, is it's not the active chipping away at somebody else's views. It's not the idea. It's the valid questioning and critical thinking about those. And if one finds, and I think that's the really what's the goal here, and we keep talking about this, come up again and again, is our goal is to help people in their reduction and release from suffering. Yeah. And if this practice does it, if a belief in rebirth helps them in their moment by moment actions and activities, I don't have a problem with someone else holding that belief. If it helps them. You're wrong if you don't think that, which has been happening lately, that's where I'm going to say, well, okay, then please tell me how that is a bad thing in the way I'm practicing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a shame, isn't it? But there are Buddhist fundamentalists, and there are people who take things quite literally, and I think that makes life overly difficult. And if you want to think about things, then you come up with contradictions. You can't sort of read two texts and find them completely in agreement almost. It's a 2,500-year-old tradition that's grown like a weed, almost. I mean, I don't mean that disrespectfully. I mean just that there's so many different kinds of Buddhism. There's so many approaches, and
and that's, I think, a natural evolution that occurs when it reaches a new culture, a new time, a new environment, that it is going to go through some metamorphosis, so that we see Buddhism encountering the Bon religion in Tibet, and the result of that is an amalgam which we know as Tibetan Buddhism, and it looks very different than how we would see it in a traditional Sri Lankan Theravadan temple. Or a Zen center would be completely different. And yet it all shares a practice of the Eightfold Path.
Yeah, and you'd think if there was an absolute truth, that we would have all been getting closer together and closer to that truth over time, not more diverse.
Right.
And the fact is that we've got more diverse over time, so, what does that tell us? I'm not sure I can draw that conclusion because I'm thinking off the top of my head, but that's an interesting question. Well, if there is a truth, then how come? Is that just a product of delusion, and that's a fairly miserable view of humanity, then, isn't it?
Yeah, and what I wonder is how much of and this is one of the things that concerns many of us in a more modern and especially a secular context, is, believe it or not, folks of you who are very religious in your practice, we are also very concerned about not screwing up the teaching and not making it into something that is not helpful to people in their elimination of suffering, in their coming to the process of awakening. We're very concerned about that, because we're at the beginning of this pretend it's however long ago where, Bodhidharma just started doing his thing. It's like, well, I'm doing things a little different here. Am I going to screw it up by doing this? Or you move forward, fast forward, now we're in Japan, and we're looking at things a little differently. Are we going to screw it up when we do this as we put it into a context that's going to fit with our culture? Well, our modern Western place, it's its own culture, and so we're faced with those questions right now.
I know, if you go to India, you can't just behave like an American or a Kiwi or a Brit, because you just run into yourself really quickly, I mean, I've had that experience, and I know friends, and you generally, if you're in India for a while, you have this period of passing madness where it all just gets to you and you can't stand it anymore. But I can imagine in America, if you're going from north to south or east to west or vice versa, you can't just behave as though everything's the same.
Right.
And that people's attitudes are just the same,
Yeah, it is. It is very different where you're, I'm a Midwesterner, and just the cultural trappings that I see when I visit friends in Atlanta, in Georgia, is very different than is when I visit friends. I say, hopefully soon, those of you, my friends in California, want to come out this year, I'm out on retreat in West Virginia at Bhavana Society. And I think that's even more so, United States being a ginormous country, where in Europe, you go to the next state over in our mind in terms of space, and it's an entirely different language, let alone an entirely different culture. We're
do you just insist on doing it your way?
Right.
You? And, Americans have that reputation, but,
sadly well deserved.
But actually, I know a few Americans, and they're not all like that, are they?
Not all. There are a few, but
so we change our approach depending on who we're talking to.
And
it's not about right and wrong, as you say. I think that, I started using those words helpful and unhelpful a lot more these days.
And it's I think it's okay for there to be a different answers based on the situation, and that's part of Buddhist practice, is that there isn't a set of stone tablets that's unchanging about what is right and wrong for the specific circumstances, but they are guidelines for us that are, the way they're phrased is flexible to the situation. One of the things I wanted to ask you is you've been blogging for a while. I know you had some previous blogs, but what made you decide to start blogging about Buddhism?
Well, I've got this friend in Cleveland, Ohio, and we met at a conference. I was in the States for a conference, and then she came out to New Zealand for a visit, and we got on really well and kept in touch, and she got interested in Buddhism because I was talking about it all the time. And, she's my one convert, and
that's one.
She was looking around for somewhere in Cleveland to go, and I said, "Oh, well, try Shambhala." I think from what I hear, they're all right. And she's now involved in helping to organise Cleveland Shambhala. But I would write these long raves and emails to her about Buddhism. And hence the title of the blog. It's me having a rave. And the first ones are quite unsophisticated and just me going off the top of my head.
You practically sound like an American in those,
Yeah, and, you can see over time they've got a lot more technical. And I've gotten interested in language, and I did a course in Sanskrit, and I've been teaching myself Pali.
What book are you using for that? Because a lot of us we kind of struggle with that, and many of us don't do so well with languages, and we've kind of struggled finding a good book for our Pali studies.
I know. I learnt from Warder.
And
Warder's a hard book. It's not really.
Warder's a tough one.
Yeah, it's not. It's thorough, and I refer to it often.
Have you checked out Lily De Silva's? I think
I've had a little look at it. I haven't been through it in detail, but I was thinking of trying to run a Pali class here and using that as the text. But one of my colleagues in the order as a Sanskrit professor, and he had his doubts about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I don't think there is a really good Pali book. You just have to kind of get started, really.
Yeah, there is.
Have more than one. The one that I refer to quite a lot is a new course in reading Pali by Gear and Karuna Tilake. I find that a useful reference.
There's the website Pali Day by Day, and I'll provide a link for folks who are listening to the podcast. I'll go find that and link to it. But they have a lot of the books we're talking about. Yeah. Have tests in them and little quizzes, and the answer keys are in there, and that's just a wonderful site, and they have their own discussion threads on there where people ask questions about very specific topics that they have some wonderful resources on there. So Pali Day by Day, you can Google it if you don't go to the website, and you'll find it. It's a really great place to look at.
And I like to try and encourage people to have a go at Pali because it's not that hard. I mean, I learnt Sanskrit. Well, I did a year of Sanskrit. You can't really learn it in a year. Yeah. And it's hard. Sanskrit is hard because you're using a different script and it's got funny spelling rules, and then it's the grammar is relatively complex.
Mm-hmm.
I think for an English speaker, again, it's an inflected language. But Pali's not so hard, and all the texts are in Roman script, and it gives you access to quite an incredible body of literature. Not every sentence is easy to figure out, but it's such. I really enjoy doing Pali study. I've been working on a commentary on the Kachanagata Sutta recently, and it's a short text. It's relatively easy to translate, and then I can go through it word by word and think about what does this word mean, and what do I understand by this, and But the other thing is that, and this is where I'm kind of interested in the idea of secular Buddhism and what you do about this kind of stuff is, like, for me it's important to have an imaginative connection with the Buddha. So I've been on pilgrimage, and when I read, and the Buddha was staying at Savatthi, I think, I pause and I bring Savatthi to mind because I've been there. And where Anathapindika's garden is, there's a road that's pretty straight that runs up to the gateway. You can still see where the gate must have been because it's a big gap in the wall at Savatthi. You can see that the road is probably in the same place because it would be illogical to put it anywhere else. It's like a straight road. So that road is the road probably that the Buddha walked up and down to go and see King Pasenadi, and there's something about that moves me, that inspires me, that makes me want to practice.
Well, that's what you're touching on. One of the things that I asked in the beginning of the podcast a few episodes ago is what inspires us, that we do run that risk of being dry and reductionist and materialist. Well, yes, but that doesn't mean we can't be inspired. We're still human beings. We still do have emotional, psychological connections with these things, that when we hear these phrases like what you're talking about, the Buddha was, on this road and speaking with people. And when I read the suttas, and he sits down and they describe that they sat down and they made polite greetings and then they sat down, and I try to picture that because these were people, and whether we look at these as historical documentation or whether they see them as stories and who knows what happened, and I like that "thus have I heard" part they all start with. It's like, we don't know, this is what we heard, but it doesn't take away from our ability to put ourselves in that place. And when we're doing our meditation and we're going for the Brahma Viharas and we're putting ourselves in positive mental states, well, that's what we're doing. We're capitalizing on our mind's ability to do that. And if that encourages and energizes us, absolutely, there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, that's quite interesting for me. I'm into Joseph Campbell as well, and the whole idea of how myth communicates on a level that isn't rational. That's quite a big thing in our community. We often talk about the mythic context, and the need for symbols which communicate and symbolic actions like devotional practices and puja. And they're obviously the province of religion, well, the way I think about it. And I'm slightly suspicious, I suppose, of I'm suspicious of everything, but I'm slightly suspicious of the Buddhism which doesn't address that aspect of the human being, because actually we're not very rational. Human beings aren't very rational, and if I wanted to change your mind about something, probably the last way to do it would be to have an argument with you.
Right.
Yeah.
We've had that in the episode prior to this one from last week in our talk with Pam Gay. We talk about, and I've got videos out there to the Don't Be a Dick talk that was given at TAM, where we make the point, how many people have ever been convinced by someone screaming at your face that you're an idiot? Of course, no one is.
Or even just telling you you're wrong.
Right, and we've seen, you and I have both, I'm sure, seen debates where there was a very rational side and there was a wackadoodle side, and the wackadoodle won the debate because they connected with their audience.
Yeah.
The other person may have had much better arguments, but they didn't connect with their audience at all. And I think what you're touching on is Joe Campbell's, I presume, Power of Myth is one of the books that you're talking about. And one of the conversations that's going on today on the Facebook fan page is there's an article about a ceremony that's very rarely done, and it's about sharing of merit. And yes, absolutely, it puts people in a positive frame of mind, and that helps with their practice. And that's absolutely something we want to encourage. Where I run into challenges with that, and the thing I was asking about is, since merit, at least in the early text, is not transferable, you can't beat Bobby because Timmy did something wrong, that kind of thing doesn't work. And that rites and rituals are among the first fetters to drop away upon stream entry. So it's rites and rituals as ends in themselves. Right,
it's not rites and rituals per se.
Right, so what's the point is that magical thinking that if I do this ritual, then I've manipulated the universe. Of course, that's the part we want to get away from. And as a secularist, my thought is there a risk that this kind of thing can support that kind of magical thinking, as opposed to, hey, we're all putting ourselves in a really good mental place, and we're human beings, and this ritual helps us to practice and inculcate this in our lives.
Yeah.
I think there's a big gap there that we may see people on both sides, and what's going to be the positive effect? Again, what's the goal in having
and it's hard to tell with other people, I think one of my pragmatic things is that I try and be focused on how this is for me. I know people who believe all sorts of things, and UFOs, moon landing hoaxes, ghosts, the full gamut really. And these are all Buddhists, and they all practice, and they're all good people. And I sort of was thinking, well, in a way, it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what you believe from my
right, it doesn't affect me if you believe in
as long as we can have a conversation like this, then the fact that you believe or don't believe something is, how relevant is that, So.
Now, the other big topic I wanted for us to chat about, so I know it was the conversation we were having before the interview started, is talking about rebirth. And there was a thing, I wanted to read a quote of yours from one of your recent blog posts. So be patient, it's a couple sentences long, but you stated things very eloquently, and I want to make sure to share that with the listeners. You had stated, and then there's the placebo effect, the phenomenon that we heal better if we believe we have an effective treatment. Even though it may be false to state that we have actually had an effective treatment, still we fare better than if we'd had no treatment at all. I argued this in the case of karma, which cannot be either verified or disproved, but is still useful as a view in helping to determine how we should behave. That is, I believe the theory of karma is morally helpful, even though it has doubtful truth value, if only in a provisional sense. It was very well said is that you're making a point that this provides value to people in their practice, that its verifiability is an independent thing of the experience and how it helps them to practice.
Yeah. I mean, how would you verify something like karma? I mean, in my post on rebirth, I was saying, well, you have to account for memories that survive death. So basically, you have to sort of propose some kind of external hard drive.
Right.
Thing that,
when I die, I connect to the universal server, and that's got my memories in it. So
well, then you're a Hindu, aren't you? Or some kind of eternalist. And I think that's the problem. If you try to deal with these issues as metaphysical issues, you end up slipping into nihilism or eternalism eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know in a way whether a belief in karma helps or not. But I think it definitely has the potential to help if you go about it the right way. And I think Buddhism's like that, really. If you go about things the right way, then they'll be helpful.
Right. And that's, I think, what you're really where you're going there, if I'm hearing you right, and jump all over it if I'm wrong, is that's really the indicator is it helping you? And if it's something where your belief in rebirth is in some fashion detracting from your practice in this very moment, whether it's in your meditation, you're constantly either worried about, oh my goodness, I was a terrible person in a previous life, I've had it, or oh, what am I going to be? And you're either going into the past or the future instead of being in the current moment. I would say that might be one of the things to watch out for.
Yeah.
But if it's really just what I do has effects beyond me, then great, you got the point. That's really the important part.
Well, I think so, yeah. And I also would say, it's very, very much in the first person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's none of, if I see my friend doing something that I think is going to harm them, then I would say something. But in a way, it's not up to me to police other people's views.
Right.
Like having a view about your view, well, how helpful is that to anyone?
That's already kind of complicated at that point.
Yeah, but I can look at my own views and say, well, is this helpful for me? And I can do something about that. And I think that it's kind of helpful. I mean, in a community there are interchanges, and you and I having a discussion about this, and it makes us think, and hopefully it makes other people think about it as well. We come at it from different angles, different times, but it's very much about, is this helpful for me?
Right.
And not so much about judging other people. I think it's very easy for us to get into, he's doing that, but it's just rubbish, really. And
right, and that's one of the risks that we run, and I see this a great deal in the communities I'm involved with that are atheist or the skeptical communities, that there tends to be that being a dick thing where you're casting aspersions. Thank you, Phil Plait, for using that, because now I could use that for
Benedict Dawkins.
And Dawkins, who, and Dawkins, it was interesting because Dawkins was at that TAM where that speech occurred.
Oh yeah.
I've been, he gets accused of being really harsh, and he's not. And any interviews I've seen with him, he's like, no, he asks questions. And I think where we as Buddhist practitioners in our practice of right speech, and we all make mistakes. I make them myself. I also make these mistakes. I try to be a bit more careful about the things I post on Facebook and the links I put out there and the quotes I put out there, that I want them to be questions about how does that work, and I don't understand this, versus, wow, that's dumb. I don't think that's valid, because it's a personal experience thing. Now, if the claim is Deepak Chopra saying he caused an earthquake during his meditation, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, no, I'm calling shenanigans. You got to show me how that works. But he's done that kind of thing, and that's where someone making a living off of using pseudoscientific phrases of quantum theory and you can change the... No, that's a verifiable, measurable thing. And that's where I am going to say, nope, not so.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, those sorts of examples are quite interesting, aren't they? Because if you think about it, you think, well, no, that doesn't sound right. But a lot of people really want to believe that there are people in this world that can cause earthquakes when they're meditating, and they just seem to lap it up.
Yeah, and
he's a rich man, isn't he, writing those science?
Yeah, and you think about it, this is one of the things I was thinking about, oddly, and I drive to work last week, that why is it that people are really want to see that as being a true thing? And what was coming up for me is, and why Buddhists are doing that, because we are supposedly in a practice of questioning, where, okay, if Deepak Chopra or someone else can levitate or walk through walls or cause earthquakes or whatever the claim is, or have out-of-body experiences, and actually in the traditional sense of, nope, you zip up out of your body, or you actually do physically walk through a wall. If it's one of those things, A, I'd like to see it, but B, the thing is, wow, that's a way to have some control and some power over the natural world, and I'm on that path, and if they can do it, maybe someday I'll be able to do it too, and that's a teaser. And that teaser is the same kind of thing that leads people to alcohol addiction, to gambling addictions, to a host of maybe not so positive things.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
So I just wonder how much of it is, ooh, that's cool, and you identify with wanting to do that yourself, and that's where the hook is.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting for a Buddhism that's more secular, or even, what I would say pragmatic. I think our views are actually quite similar, aren't they? But I just call it something different.
There's similar, and that's one of the questions that come up, is the difference between secular and pragmatic, and the one and skeptical, because that in one of the other blogs that I have linked on the Buddhism resources page asked that question, and there is an answer. Our friend Linda Blanchard that I chatted with has an answer in there, and I haven't had a chance to respond. There's a technical problem. I can't reply to this one. Where Linda took a very intentional selection of using skeptical Buddhism for the creation of the group that she has on Facebook, and I very specifically chose secular. And we have just somewhat different focuses. There is some relationship between the two, but for me it was a matter of wanting to have a practice that can fit within different religious contexts. And so that was a very particular intent, and for me, I know there was a lot of discussion in the skeptical community about, we have a problem with the word skeptical. It is often misinterpreted as cynical. And I wanted to kind of stay away from that and separate myself from it. I didn't have any, or sense any baggage around secular, except with very religious people. I have a big problem with that word.
But it's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see how successful these kind of new approaches to Buddhism are, and it might take a while before that becomes clear. Whether we attract people with this kind of idea.
It is. I'm curious to see, because those of us who are involved in it we're hearing from people that, I didn't know that I thought I was the only person, and thank you for putting this out there, because this enables me it gave me permission to practice in this way, and it not be a horrible, and I'm a bad Buddhist because I have some questions, that's okay.
Yeah, a lot of people have kind of moved away from superstition and from blind faith and organized religion for good reasons, and they find Buddhism attractive, but then, oh, well, this seems to have some of the same problems. And
right. Right. You're chased away from, many people also come to it from not having positive experiences with their home tradition, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they come to Buddhism thinking, oh, this is more rational. I've got meditation. There's an actual practice here. And then finding they're having the same issues that they had with the religious components of it. And that was one of the struggles that I had, is that, and for a long time, I didn't even really understand what my cognitive dissonance was about.
Yeah. Well, my teacher, Sangharakshita, he used to use the language of German idealists, and so he would often talk about the absolute and the transcendental. And I think, he was pretty clear that he was using those terms metaphorically, so I don't think he was confused, but I think a lot of us were.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he doesn't use that language anymore. He's made a definite sort of step back from talking that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember my sense of discomfort with those terms came before his sort of saying, well, actually, no, that doesn't seem to have worked. Let's not talk like that anymore. And so I had a period of like, oh, am I out of sync with my teacher, with my community? And then it was quite uncomfortable. But I sort of realized, well, I don't use the word reality anymore if I'm talking about Buddhism. I don't think we can talk about reality, really. It doesn't sort of work for me. I talk about experience, and that does. You can say quite sensible things about experience, but once you start talking about reality, you're into this sort of metaphysical realm, and you just,
Well, you had made the statement, I agree with you, that I hold the view that the Buddha was always talking about experience, the subjective, rather than the world. And I think you're absolutely right. He wasn't teaching mathematics or physics or chemistry.
Yeah.
And as he supposedly had said, it is, I teach you one thing, suffering and the elimination of it.
He says that often,
mm-hmm.
in the Pali Canon, he says that often.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And really, when you think about it, he was in Iron Age India. Iron was not necessarily new by then, but if we accept the historical dates, iron was the top technology. So we're talking axes, knives, perhaps iron sheathing on the plows. So it wasn't a sophisticated technological era. You have to. I think that's one of the good things I think about studying history, is to put these early teachings in some kind of context. And one of the weird things about India is you can go there and you can see that context still there. I mean, I've seen men ploughing fields with wooden ploughs, pulled behind a couple of big bulls. And, I was like, but hang on, didn't they get iron ploughs in, 2500 BC or something? Yeah.
And that's, there's different levels of technological advancement that it may have been around for a very long time, but not everyone has quite got there due to, economic reasons. There's so many things that impact that.
Yeah.
I wanted to say you have a class coming up in December. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, so I'm going to be studying the Kachinagata Sutta, and there's a few really interesting questions there. One is, the Buddha often talks about the world, loka, and I think I follow when you were saying before about experience, and the Buddha was always talking about experience. I'm quite influenced by a scholar called Sue Hamilton, who's no longer active in the field, unfortunately. Sue Hamilton's work I found, especially on the skandhas, or the khandhas in Pali, I found very influential. But the Kachinagata Sutta is about the world and the question of right view, but also whether things exist or don't exist. So questions like that, and it's a short sutta, And probably, people already have ideas about that. If they know Buddhism at all, they'll know that, we don't usually talk about existence and non-existence, but I wanted to use the sutta as a way of going into those questions and asking questions about, when the Buddha says the world, what does he mean? What's that?
Yeah, does that mean the planet Earth? Does that mean does that mean our experience within our own minds of everything?
And I suppose I'd argue that when he says world, our world, he means our own world. And one that's not entirely subjective and not entirely objective, but arises in dependence on the interaction between, sense faculty and sense object, subjective and objective. So, yeah, it's a chance to explore that. And
when's that going to be?
It's in December, December the 28th. So, yeah, I'm hoping to do a bit more of that sort of thing. I think there's advantages to sitting at home blogging, but it's also nice to take it out and talk it over with people and see where my limitations are.
I'm fine, Eddie. Yeah, very much so. Well, the blog is Jayarava's Raves. Jayarava, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm just so glad you were here, and I hope to have you back on the podcast again.
Oh, thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.